Hello, I'm Neil Mackenzie, a professional wine merchant and wine expert, and I'm here to guide you through your wine pack that you've recently purchased. In this wine pack, you'll also find details of how to actually buy these wines should you want to perhaps use them for further study. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm a big fan of Sauvignon Blanc, and in particular Sancerre from the Loire Valley. The Loire Valley, I think, is one of the most amazing wine growing areas in the world, let alone France. It's 600 kilometers long, and within that space, within that long strip of valley, there are more grape varieties and different styles of wine grown than anywhere else I can think of. Of course, you start on the sea end, if you like, of the valley, of the Pays Nantais with Muscadets, you have your Semeurs, you have your Touraines, but then right at the end of the valley, in other words, right in the centre of France, you have the central vineyards. Not terribly romantic calling them the central vineyards, but I tell you what, they produce some fantastic wines. Here we have the towns of Sancerre and Puy-sur-Loire. Sancerre and both Puy-sur-Loire, which produces Puy Fumé, produce stunning Sauvignon Blancs. They're really made by artisanal producers, very small producers dedicated to quality. And here we see these really zesty, fresh, crisp, minerally rich wines, which are very hard to find elsewhere. The wine I want to talk to you about is actually a Sancerre made by Merlin Cherrier, which is this wine here. Merlin Cherrier are just outside the famous little village of Bouet, where most recognised producers will normally have some plots. He has about 13 hectares, so not a big producer, but certainly a well-known producer. He also has some vines in a really special vineyard site called the Chêne de Marchand, which really is the top Sancerre site. This is his basic Sancerre, but when I tell you basic, this wine packs more of a punch than most Sancerres you'll find on a market. So let's taste the wine and see. With all Sancerre, we're looking for a wine that's clean and bright in the glass, which it certainly is. Very young Sancerre won't have much colour, it'll be water white. This, although it's not that old, has a little bit of colour to it now. It's a wonderful looking wine. On the nose, lovely zesty, lemony, citrusy aromas, exactly what you expect from a good Sancerre. And on the palate, very important, lovely racing acidity, which is so important to a wine like this, to have that balance of acid and fruit. Lovely lemony and slight citrusy fruit there, absolutely wonderful. And the flavour goes on and on and on. That really is a super wine. You can probably tell I like this wine. You know, Sancerre is an amazing place, it really is. And of course has an amazing history to it. But before I tell you about the history, I must just tell you about this particular producer, because yes, he is old-fashioned. They use lots of stainless steel. They don't believe in wood. Some of the more modern producers will use a little bit of oak to impart the phenols and the creaminess that you expect with an oaked wine. But here they want nice, lean and crisp and minerally wines. And this, of course, is what you get with maturing your wines in stainless steel tanks. These are great wines, they really are. But regards to the history, it's extraordinary because everyone talks about Sauvignon Blanc and the central vineyards of the Loire Valley. But in fact, Sauvignon Blanc has only been grown here for about 120 years. In fact, this area of the Loire Valley was once part of the Duchy of Burgundy during medieval times. So of course they grew Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, just like Burgundy. But when phylloxera came along in the 1880s, it decimated the vineyards of the Loire Valley like it did most of France. And in doing so, it completely destroyed the Chardonnay vines. A little bit of Pinot Noir was left behind, and we still see outcrops of Pinot Noir, which of course is why Sancerre produces a very small quantity of Pinot Noir as well. But Chardonnay completely disappeared. Sauvignon Blanc was replanted because it was basically thought that this had more of a chance of survival. So of course this is why we see Sauvignon Blanc to this day. Most appellations within the area will only allow Sauvignon Blanc, Although there is one just outside the central vineyard area called Châteauneuf, where they actually allow a little Chardonnay. Oh, shock horror, they've actually allowed Chardonnay back. But I tell you what, it's a great wine. Anyway, here we have a wine 100% Sauvignon Blanc. And I tell you what, if you're looking for a food to go with this wine, try a goat's cheese, in particular, a little goat's cheese called the Crottin de Chavignol. These two are an absolute match made in heaven. Hope you enjoy it. Cheers. When one thinks about the Rhone Valley, one thinks of big, powerful, spicy, fiery reds. And certainly you won't be disappointed with the next wine. This wine is actually Domaine Remizieres, which is Crozes Hermitage up in the northern Rhone. The Rhone Valley, as you know, is a long, long valley running through the eastern side of France. It starts way up in Vienne, where you have the tip of the northern Rhone, comes all the way down to Valence. And here within the northern Rhone, you have Syrah country. This is 100% Syrah. No other red grape variety is used. In the southern Rhone, which starts at Montélimar, about 25 miles south of the northern Rhone, running all the way down to Avignon, you have a big mix of grape varieties, but that's for another wine. So here up in the northern Rhone, as I said, big, powerful, dry, tannic red wines, but not as dry and as tannic as you would perhaps imagine, because they are allowed in some cases to blend in white wine as well, or white grape varieties, either Viognier or Marsanne and Roussanne. So right at the top of the northern Rhone, you have Côte Rôtie, and Côte Rôtie is allowed to use up to about 20% Viognier, usually big, black, inky styles of wine, lovely wines. But using a little bit of Viognier gives the wine that slightly scented fruit and of course a little bit of softness as well. And then you travel south of the Côte Rôtie and you have Condrieu, which is famed for its white wines of Viognier. And within Condrieu, you have this tiny little appellation of its own called Châteauneuf. There's only one other property in France that has its own appellation as well as Gruyère, and that of course is Domaine Romanée-Conti, so really in quite rarefied company. And then you travel down to the left-hand side of the Rhone Valley and you have Saint-Joseph, where they actually use, again, Syrah, but they're allowed to use a little bit of Marsanne or Roussanne, which are white grape varieties, to soften the wine. But over on the other side of the river, we have Crozes Hermitage, and within it, the little enclave of Hermitage. And here, Crozes Hermitage again uses mainly Syrah, but can use a little bit of Marsanne Roussanne. And then you travel further south and you get to Cornas, big, inky, black wines. And then, of course, and by the way, they're only allowed to use Syrah. They can't use any white wines at all, which is why they're so black. And then you get down to Sancerre, which are actually sparkling wines made from Marsanne and Roussanne. Really interesting mix of wines. Anyway, back up to Hermitage and Crozes Hermitage, and I thought we'd look at this wine because this really is quite extraordinary. This producer doesn't use any white wine grapes at all. This is 100% Syrah. So let's taste this wine together. Being 100% Syrah, you expect a bit of colour in the glass, which it certainly has. And on the nose, oh, that lovely blackberry fruit, and really slightly jammy as well. Lots of oodles and oodles of richness coming out of that wine. Oh, smells great. But let's try it. Wow, that packs a punch. Lovely vein of acidity running through the wine. Lovely, juicy, jammy fruit. That really is coming out quite well. You know what? Happily drink this now, but put this down for another year or two and it might even be better. It's a wonderful wine. Give it a go. So this producer is quite extraordinary, Remizieres, because up until 1977, they basically owned apple orchards and grew some grapes and basically supplied them to cooperatives. But they realised that actually there might be some value in trying to make wine, funnily enough, and they started their own winery. And of course, since then, they've gone from strength to strength, but only using Syrah, which is really important for them because they want to produce a very big style of wine. They use a little bit of oak maturation, not too much, but certainly enough to give the wine some flavour and some character. They certainly throw in the stems and the stalks as well as the grapes into the crusher, so it gives it some tannin as well, and that's really important when you're making these wines, to give it some structure, perhaps a more traditional approach. The Northern Rhone has an amazing history, especially around Tain Hermitage and the Crozes Hermitage region. Julius Caesar arrived there in probably about 2,200 years ago, and when he arrived, he found that the tribes were not that friendly. And he found very quickly that they were rather partial to wine, Roman wine. And very soon they stopped fighting. And in fact, the Allobroge tribes were so keen on wine that they would swap their own slaves for 1 amphora, about 40 litres of wine. So very highly prized. So in doing so, Caesar actually managed to save a lot of his troops from battle by using Roman wine. What a great way to go about fighting. Just drink wine. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this wine. I certainly do. Cheers. Great wine. One of my most favourite wine areas to talk about is Châteauneuf du Pape. Châteauneuf, of course, is way down in the southern Rhone section of the Rhone Valley. It starts around Montélimar in the north and goes all the way down to Avignon and beyond in the south. Unlike the northern Rhone Valley, which is very steep-sided and has back-breaking vineyards to go and pick grapes in, the southern Rhone is very flat and is characterised by these rock pebble-sized chunks of glacial deposit that lie all over the vineyards, scattered all around the vines. And these act as a kind of natural central heating system. They're extraordinary because these white rocks absorb the sunlight of the day and keep and retain that heat, and over the night time give that heat back to the vines, and in doing so allow the vines to ripen even more, which is really essential with some of the grape varieties that they use, because you're not just using Syrah, they're allowed to use up to 18 different grape varieties. But predominantly the main grape varieties are Grenache, Syrah and Mourvèdre. It's a wonderful area, full of huge amount of complexity and diversity. And a producer I've chosen for you is Domaine de Grand Tinel in the Châteauneuf du Pape. Lovely producer, owned by the Cherrier family. And we'll talk about the producer in a moment, but let's taste the wine first of all. The wine has a lovely, deep, opaque colour, super colour in the glass. And on the nose, that wonderful jammy fruit, damson jam that you get with the Grenache grape variety. Absolute classic. And then let's taste it. Lovely, rich and full. A little bit of tannin there, which is what you expect, especially when I tell you how they make this wine. But that tannin really gives the wine some longevity. But also that richness of the Grenache and super ripe grapes as well. That's a super wine, that really is. I think you'll enjoy this. You know, 90% of the production of wine comes in the Côte d'Rhône region comes from the southern Rhone. So it's a big producing region. But of course the quality wines really come from Châteauneuf du Pape. It's an extraordinary place, it really is. I mentioned the galettes earlier, this natural central heating system, which is extraordinary to see. But also they tend to be quite traditional. They use a lot of Grenache in the blend, and I say they can use a blend of up to 18 different grape varieties because back in medieval times, many crops failed. They didn't know what they were growing and what would work. So that's why they grew as many grape varieties as possible to make sure that they could make a wine every year. And so for that reason, still to this day, they grow these different grape varieties. But Grenache is perhaps the dominant grape variety, and the traditionalists always stick to Grenache. They'll blend with a little bit of Syrah, a little bit of Mourvèdre, and they'll use maybe some white wine grape varieties like Marsanne and Roussanne as well. But certainly here at Cherrier, they're using predominantly Grenache. They use wood maturation, but mainly old wood to mature the wines. And when I say old wood, I'm talking about wood that's probably 2 or 3 years old. So there aren't a huge amount of phenols and aromatics being imported into the wood. So what you're getting is just the pure wine flavour. And also, when they're actually picking the grapes, all hand-picked of course, they put the grapes into the crusher with the stems and the stalks and everything else. So you're getting that tannin coming through from that. Tannin is the natural preservative in the wine. If you've ever drunk a cup of tea that tastes really tannic and really tight because the tea bag's been in there for way too long, that's tannin, and that's the flavour you get. But of course, with wine, that's all integrated into the fruit to give you the lovely soft balance that you expect. This really, I think, has quite a way to go. It's drinking beautifully now, but I think you could probably enjoy it also in 2 or 3 years' time. Châteauneuf has a wonderful history, like all wine regions in France. It's certainly been afforded a lot of popularity recently, but way back in medieval times, it had quite an interesting trip. In 1308, the wine region wasn't really regarded with great reputation. But at the time, the French church split with the church in Rome, being Roman Catholic, and set up its own papacy at the town of Avignon. And over the next 67 years, 9 successive popes lived in Avignon. And of course, being a pope in those days meant that you had to eat well and drink fine wine. So wine production was somewhat, shall we say, pumped up to allow these churchmen to enjoy their fine wine. The first Pope, Clement V, came from Bordeaux, and he brought Bordeaux grape varieties with him, which didn't really work. But the second Pope, John the 22nd, was a real bon viveur and wine lover, and he really got wine growing going in the region. Of course, when the papacy ended around 1376, wine still continued. And indeed, over the next few centuries, the reputation of Châteauneuf-du-Pape absolutely soared. Even though Châteauneuf-du-Pape as a town itself didn't exist, that didn't come along till about the 1850s. But then phylloxera, as I've mentioned before, devastated the vineyards, absolutely destroyed most of the grape varieties. And so there was a massive replanting in the area. What that meant was that they were desperate for volumes, and they planted grape varieties that would give them that. The quality, I have to say, somewhat suffered. And very quickly, the whole of the Rhone region, and in particular the southern Rhone, was just there to produce big volume wines of very poor quality. But they were still quite beefy and powerful, even if they didn't have the quality. And they were used or called a vin de médecin. And these were wines which were sent up to Burgundy to beef out the Burgundian wines. So in those days, you might have drunk a wonderful Nuits Saint-Georges or Gevrey-Chambertin or Chambord-Musigny. The chances were that half of that wine would have been Châteauneuf-du-Pape. The wine area was in complete chaos. And luckily for us and for Châteauneuf, a chap called the Baron de Roy came along, who owned Château Fortier in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and he realised there had to be some regulation. And in 1923, he came up with the concept of the appellation, the first prototype of the appellation in France, and indeed anywhere in the world. And he basically decided that what you had to have was a limit on the amount of wine you could produce. Also, the wine had to be of a certain alcoholic content, which meant that the grapes had to be picked only when ripe. He also said that the vineyards where you plant your Mourvedre or Grenache or whatever had to be vineyards that could also support thyme and lavender. And if you've ever grown those two herbs before, you'll know that actually those conditions have to be quite arid. He wanted the vines to struggle, and by struggling to get down to the water table, it meant that the vines would produce top quality fruit. 1936, the law was amended to allow for up to 18 different grape varieties. And of course, to this day, that still stands. So really, we have him to thank for the first appellation laws in Châteauneuf-du-Pape and indeed in France. There's one other little law that I have to share with you, which I think is actually hilarious. In 1954, a committee in Châteauneuf-du-Pape decreed that flying saucers weren't allowed to take off or fly overhead and land anywhere within the Châteauneuf-du-Pape region. I would love to have been at that meeting when they decided that law, I can tell you. I can only assume a huge amount of wine must have been consumed. Anyway, enjoy this wine. I certainly will. Cheers. Oh, delicious.